Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we believe mental illness can be temporary and transformative. Stay tuned for innovative, effective tools from experts in the field of mental health. Hosted by Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist. This podcast aims to change the narrative around mental illness. Move from a place of fear to a place of hope and solutions. Here on Your Mind.
Dr. Peter Breggin, MD, is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and former consultant at the National Institutes of Mental Health, who has been called the Conscience of Psychiatry. He has many decades of successful efforts to reform the mental health field. His work provides the foundation for modern criticism of psychiatric diagnoses and drugs, and leads the way in promoting more caring and effective therapies. His research and educational projects have brought about major changes in the FDA approval, full prescribing information, and in labels for dozens of antipsychotic and antidepressant drugs. He continues to educate the public and professionals about the tragic psychiatric drugging of America's children. Let's dive in and have you tell us about how you got into what you're doing and have your focus on this psychiatric drug withdrawal, which is such a powerful, important tool for families and people and providers.
Right. Well, I got into this whole area when I was 18 years old at Harvard, my freshman year, and a friend said he and his brother had started this volunteer program at a state mental hospital. I'd always been interested in psychology, never imagined being a physician. At Harvard, I ended up going out to the state hospital, and it reminded me so much when I walked into it as my Uncle Dutch's descriptions of a Nazi extermination camp he'd liberated during World War II. It was just a dreadful place. I mean, corridors of people sitting on benches, lying on the floor, obviously insensitive aides, maybe playing cards behind a glassed window, or maybe, we would come eventually upon people being abused by the aides. The doctors were arrogant and indifferent. I saw electroshock treatment. I ended up running the program, so I became very involved in it. And at one point I went to the superintendent and I said, we want to do a group of students, about a dozen of us, of the couple of hundred that come in through Harvard and Radcliffe, and each have our own patient. He thought this was outrageous. I talked and cajoled him into it. And we set up a program that we called the Case Aid Program, and it ended up that instead of hurting the patients, like the Psychoanalytic Institute of Boston warned the hospital, we would hurt the patients, these poor backward souls who never saw a therapist, let alone a psychoanalyst. And we ended up getting most of them out of the hospital, I think 13 out of 15 or something like that.
Wow.
And that just convinced me right away that what people needed was human services. Even though I didn't know a lot about love in my own life, I knew that love was somehow real, and I talked about love and care, and it was just there. And it was also obvious to me that even though I was very successful, I mean, here I was at Harvard, I was very vulnerable, and I felt like there, but for the grace of God, go I. And so I just promoted this program. I ended up working with Harvard professors, and we got a write-up in a very important, the last psychosocial document ever put out by the National Institutes of Mental Health. We were cited a couple of times and got a lot of publicity. And that induced me to become a psychiatrist. I had no idea that actually 1954 and 58, when I was working in these hospitals, was a time of advancement in psychiatry compared to where we'd be now. Because at the time, there was a social psychiatry, there was a community psychiatry, there were psychoanalysts with all their flaws and their really cult-like view of themselves. there were these different alternatives going on around psychiatry and even within it. But by the time I graduated and went on to, as a psychiatrist, full-fledged psychiatrist, and went on to National Institute of Mental Health, all the psychosocial had been purged. And I could see literally in 1968, when I left the National Institute of Mental Health, that there was no place for a psychologically, socially, ethically oriented psychiatrist in psychiatry, that I was not going to be the youngest president of the American Psychiatric Association. I was going to be outside the establishment to a great extent. And then I went into private practice and was enjoying that and thriving, and I discovered that lobotomy was coming back in 1972. And then I just said, well, this can't happen again. I saw lobotomized patients at Harvard, and also I visited Boston State during my college days when I was so active as a volunteer leader, and I just knew this was an atrocity. I'd even read lobotomy books, Walter Freeman's book, back in college, and I decided that somebody was going to have to stand up and say no. Well, I had no idea that instead of being the youngest president of the American Psychiatric Association, I'd probably be the youngest person who they ever put a target on his back and said, we got to stop him. We got to get him. And that began a career. I put 4 or 5 years into stopping this atrocity and succeeded in pretty much shutting it down in the Western world, even in Japan and some of the projects in India. Only the most arrogant remained, Harvard and Brown, and I think they're petering out now. I found out, very apropos to a lot of interest right now, that there was a lot of racism behind psychosurgery in the 60s. Harvard professors were getting funding on the grounds that there was something wrong with the brains of urban rioters, that is African-American leaders like Rat Brown, and that was, of course, to me ridiculous. And there were also some surgeries being done at a African-American segregated institution in Jackson, Mississippi. I stopped those. I shut down the Harvard program. And I was now a reformer, and people began to say, well, what about shock treatment? What about the drugs? And I started to look more and to learn more. And of course, shock treatment turns out to be nothing but a closed head lobotomy with electricity,
right.
Very, very traumatic to the brain. And then I looked at the phenothiazines and the other antipsychotic drugs, which are more correctly called neuroleptics, which was their original designation, because that infers that they are neurotoxic. And I went back and began to realize that, well, these drugs are just neurotoxins. They're not medications. They're brain disabling. And I began to write about that. And suddenly I was on the cutting edge of research in the field of psychiatric drugs. Then in the early 1990s, I was approached after they vetted everybody they could find. I was apparently the only psychiatrist with the courage. Maybe they had some others, but they chose me to be the single scientist for all the combined lawsuits against Eli Lilly for Prozac, which numbered about 150 or so, and a federal court approved me, and I became the first person to look inside a drug company, really, on psychiatric drugs in any depth, and I was appalled. I mean, the clinical trials were a sham. They were manipulated. They were much too short. There was collaboration between the FDA and Eli Lilly to make sure that the trials got approved, even when they were done illegitimately, by also medicating patients with sedatives to calm them down after they got overstimulated by Prozac. Right in the trials, they were breaking the rules. trying to do something with this cocaine-like drug, which they were realizing at the FDA, and so many amphetamine-like effects on people. And I just learned more than I ever dreamed about how bad clinical trials are. You know, they're called the gold standard by the drug companies because they bring in all the gold. They're not science. They're always heavily manipulated and controlled. And so I've spent my career, you know, writing 20 or more books, going way back to some early novels that dealt with the subject, because that's what I planned to be before I became a reformer, as a novelist. And I've just been promoting more caring alternatives, human service alternatives, and criticizing the psychiatric drugs now, and electroshock and lobotomy for many, many decades. Bert Karen, who was a wonderful professor of psychology, he's gone now, dubbed me the Conscience of Psychiatry, and let me put that on one of my books. And that's something I look back now at the age of 84 with great pride. And I'm a living testimonial that if they don't kill you, it's quite a wonderful thing to be a reformer if you survive it. But it's very dangerous.
And one of the benefits of your staying the course and being a reformer is this book, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, the guide for prescribers, therapists, patients, and their families. And I'd love to spend some time talking about this because as a clinician myself, seeing so many people who come into my office on 2, 3, 4, and more medications. And I'm not necessarily anti-medication, but my thought is if you're on a medication and it's working, why do you need to see a therapist? If you're on 5 medications and they're helping, why do you need a therapist? And yet it's so difficult to get off of so many of these. And that's why I'm thrilled to be looking into your book, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, because I have a whole host of families I deal with who don't know how to help their loved one get off of it, and a whole series of medical doctors and psychiatrists I deal with who don't really know. So tell us about what brought you to this book and what it offers us.
Well, let me begin by addressing your reluctance to say you're anti-drug. I think that the only rational position there is that neurotoxins are not good for the brain and they can't possibly cure anybody of a disorder that's psychosocial in origins. And indeed, they couldn't cure anybody of a biochemical imbalance if they existed. They don't exist in the brains of patients until the first drug. Then they have multiple biochemical imbalances. So first, consider the irony that there are literally no known genetic or biochemical causes of anything we call a psychiatric disorder. 0. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about so-called bipolar disorder or so-called schizophrenia. Doesn't matter. And no one will ever debate me on that. They'll just try to stop me from talking. So that's the first principle that I want to kind of address in terms of being so-called anti-drug. The second one is that all psychiatric drugs are neurotoxins. You really don't want to take them. They harm your brain. There are no known long-term benefits from any psychiatric drug. They can't even barely do long-term studies because they're so damaging to people. They don't want the results. So no biochemical imbalances, no drugs that help people. They're neurotoxins, and people think they're helping because they are blunted in their emotions. It's the edge is taken off. If you give a neurotoxin of almost any kind, doesn't have to be called a psychiatric drug. It could be anything. It could be small doses of any poison. One of the first things going to happen is the frontal lobes of the brain are going to not function as well. You won't feel as much suffering. You may get some horrible side effect, which your doctor will then say will go away soon or something. or that it's your mind and just your symptoms are getting worse for some unknown reason since we started the drug. Maybe we unmasked your symptoms or some craziness that my colleagues will create. But the fact of the matter is that all these drugs can do is either subdue your emotions generally, and if they are doing specific kinds of harms, they'll cause a euphoria. And very often patients go from one antidepressant to another because for a few weeks they became euphoric on them, or a few days, so they keep looking. It's also how people get into cocaine. They get a euphoria, they keep looking. They keep raising the doses of cocaine, but you can't do that with psychiatric drugs. It'll kill you. So they don't get into that particular process, and they're also so suppressive. So there's a lot of space for psychologists to say, we're not doing this anymore. And I have a paper out called Rational Principles of Psychopharmacology, and it's in a journal. That's a psychology journal. Contemporary Psychology, I think it is. And then you can get it on my website, Breggin.com. I'm hoping that psychologists will take a stand now, and they're just going to start saying to patients, read this book, read that book, put it in, I'm not a medical doctor, but I think that's ridiculous. We don't have to be medical doctors like I am to criticize medical procedures and things. That's just some sort of old thing from the Middle Ages, when we had these craft guilds to keep other people shut up all the time. And tell people, read Breggin's book, read Peter Garretsky's new book, read Bob Whitaker's books. And if a psychologist reads one of those books, one of my key books, one of Peter Garretsky's key books, one of Bob Whitaker's key books, he's just a journalist, Bob Whitaker. I always call him a scientist, but I'm just a journalist. He's a scientist. And you'll know more than the psychiatrists, let alone the pediatrician or the nurse practitioner or the physician's assistant who's prescribing for your patient. And I don't know of any lawsuits against psychologists for giving honest opinions and directing people to reading about psych drugs. All the lawsuits are against the prescribers. And I've actually volunteered, I may be getting too old for this now, but I volunteered to defend any psychologist who in good faith simply gives proper instructions to patients, proper information about the drugs. Like the full prescribing information, just to say, let's read the full prescribing information together. You read it, come on in, we'll talk about what it says. And the full prescribing information, drug company advocates will lie to you and say, well, the reason that's in there is really that we're just covering ourselves. No. The drug companies fight putting adverse effects in there. They'd like sinusitis in, they'd like things like that put in to distract you, but they do not want things like severe headache, anxiety, worse, hallucinations and delusions, and they certainly don't want what's in every single, in part due to my work. I won't go into the details, but part due to my work, they don't want to go into the details in the antidepressants of how people deteriorate on these drugs, how they develop an activation syndrome that includes anxiety, insomnia, and eventually aggressivity and mania. That's all in there. And also in part due to my work, they don't want people knowing that the antipsychotic drugs cause tardive dyskinesia, which are these abnormal movements, very, very disabling, potentially even life-threatening. So, just if you go through the standard information with your patients, as a psychologist, I think you're on firm ground. And I can't guarantee you won't be sued or you won't get injured, but I've not seen a single case. And the whole threat goes back to a hospital that caved in back in the 1980s when they were threatened because they didn't give drugs to a patient. I mean, there was not even a malpractice loss. They just caved in. And it's all about fear and threat. And that's all that can keep the psychiatric system alive. So now, why did I have to be the first psychiatrist, so only a few years ago, to write a book about psychiatric drug withdrawal? Why am I still the only psychiatrist to have written a book like that? There are some works by short works, articles here and there by one other psychiatrist on benzodiazepines, and that's it. And that's just some articles. Well, the answer is that psychiatrists are simply at this point shills and salespersons for the drug companies. That's all they do. That's all they know. You're guaranteed to get a drug if you go to a psychiatrist. One of my blogs actually takes the position now, you can find it on my website or Mad in America, that people should stop going to psychiatrists. It's too dangerous now because you know you'll get a neurotoxin. They don't do anything else. You know that. So unless you want that, you'll go in that direction, you should not go to psychiatrists anymore. I mean, I just think it's time to tell the truth about all this. And I've been saying that for a while. I don't think they want to go after me about it because they don't want to publicize this issue. And because when they went after my medical license for saying on Oprah Winfrey that if you don't want to take a psychiatric drug, you don't have to start one. You can just leave the doctor's office and go find a good therapist. And they went after my medical license, backed by the Psychiatric Association, one of their AstroTurf organizations, and I won so hugely, got so much publicity, and got published my first really important book that so many people have read in the profession, Toxic Psychiatry. So maybe they don't want to stir me up or something. But I'm just telling what the truth is. And there's a whole history of psychiatry even knowing that these drugs are neurotoxins, going all the way back to the very first drug, Thorazine, which was described in their own literature as a neurotoxin. So that subdued people, quieted them down, slowed them down, gave them Parkinsonism so they couldn't move or respond much.
They used to call it the Thorazine shuffle.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you give enough of any of the new drugs, Abilify, Seroquel, Risperdal, Zyprexa, you get the Thorazine shuffle. Comes from blocking dopamine, and Parkinsonism comes from a loss of dopamine nerves. So really, it's important to try, if you can, to figure out a way to come off psychiatric drugs, in my opinion. And that should be common sense. Even if you feel it's helped you, you don't need to be on them for a lifetime. At least scientifically, we have no lifetime studies. So, everybody has to make their own decision, read a lot of stuff about this. But if you decide to come off of them, and I never push anybody, I never push my own patients, ever. But if you decide you want to come off these drugs, that the risks are too real and the benefits too obscure, you have to do it slowly. If you've been on for more than a few months, and if you're on multiple drugs, and especially if you're really a wounded person living at home on multiple drugs, you really have to come off slowly, because it could be lethal to stop them suddenly, because your brain has grown accustomed to them. And what the brain does is it fights every single drug. Instead of welcoming the drugs, psychiatrists make you think the brain's going, "Oh, I've always needed you." No, the brain's going, "Oh my God, what is this?" And it is mounting every single mechanism available in order to prevent the drug effect. So if Prozac or Celexa or any of these drugs, Zoloft, Paxil, if any of these drugs are trying to increase the amount of serotonin in your brain is fighting by multiple mechanisms against that happening. So now you stop the drug and you've got a brain that's fighting the drug. Think of it in terms of cigarettes. Why does somebody who starts smoking have to smoke every few minutes? Because they're going into withdrawal and the brain has been fighting the drug, so now they're more jittery than ever. So you take it to suppress your jitteriness, you suppress your brain, the brain starts to fight back, and every few minutes your brain is overpowering the drug, you got to take the drug again. Or alcohol, you take a couple martinis to go to sleep, you're very likely to wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning as the blood level drops and your brain is agitated in its efforts to fight the drug. The brain fights all known psychoactive substances, marijuana, the whole bunch. Doesn't want them. They're not normal. They're interferences, dreadful, drastic interferences. So they all cause withdrawal problems. So how do you go through withdrawal? You do the opposite of what your psychiatrist did or your internist did. By the way, the reason I emphasize psychiatrists, even though most of the prescribing is done by professionals with less training in psychiatry, the reason is that we're the leaders. We are the leaders of the pharmaceutical empire. We are their boys and girls. We are the ones who push the drugs, and they're my colleagues, and they need to stop. So that's why I emphasize psychiatrists. And people who go to a primary care doctor and get medication and aren't doing well, they make a huge mistake if they think the psychiatrist knows more. The psychiatrist knows less because the psychiatrist doesn't have the reasonable cautions of a primary care doc or a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant or an internist. Psychiatrists full of arrogance. They'll give you 5 drugs, which very rare do I see in malpractice suits, do I see non-psychiatrists doing. They'll very rarely, but I do have lawsuits involving this, they'll rarely give you an antipsychotic drug when you don't have any psychotic symptoms whatsoever of any kind. Although more and more they've been convinced by psychiatrists to give Abilify to help the antidepressant. That is to flatten you even more. So there isn't going to be better information. You're going to be worse off with most psychiatrists. They're unwilling to even consider drug withdrawal, most of them. Because that shows they're the emperors with no clothes. That shows that withdrawal is a terrible process, has to be done slowly with knowledge. I don't want to turn people away from reading my book, which is important, but I also have a good chapter on withdrawal in an inexpensive book called Medication Madness. It's all about how the drugs harm people. It's paperback, it's less expensive. If you can afford the medical book, get it, please. But if you can't get the chapter in Medication Madness, then read that. The most fundamental principle of psychiatric drug withdrawal is that it has to be based on your subjective experience of withdrawal. It is not about the doctor's program, not about 10% per month or per week or per day or whatever. It's certainly not your psychiatrist's formula, which is, all right, we'll have it today and I'll see you in a week. The way I start withdrawals is I figure out which is the best drug to come off. That's complicated, but often it's the most recent drug because that's often the easiest. Or it could be the most dangerous drug, which usually is the antipsychotic. Or it could be the drug that's freaking you out, which could be the antidepressant. Or it could be your addictive drug, which is the benzo. So it's a complicated conversation about which drug is first. And for that, I wish people would read the main book, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, the medical book. Once you've decided what I do, unless we're dealing with an emergency, such as the person is developing tardive dyskinesia, or the person's getting manic on the antidepressant, or some other emergency, I say, what's the smallest dose you could take of this drug? I might look up, because I'll never remember, what is the smallest pill made, or the smallest capsule made. And then I figure out with the patient whether that's something we can break up. Usually you can break up a pill that is not long-acting. Once you get into the long-acting forms, so you should talk to your pharmacist, I'll get it straight. But let's suppose it's just a Xanax tablet or a Prozac tablet, and not a long-acting. Even if it's a capsule, if it's short-acting, you can need to check with your pharmacist, but you can generally open them up and take out a few grains. I just say, let's have a success. Let's start and take a small amount. Because the reason off of your current dose, if you're taking 3 pills, let's take a small amount off 1. Let's go slow. I want you to know that it can be done, because most people are put off by the way their doctor has them do a rather abrupt withdrawal, and they just get upset and they go back on. I want you to have success. And I go from there. And as the therapist psychiatrist, I'm always being a therapist. I really have given up trying to be the supervising psychiatrist, and the therapist handles it. It's one package for me. So I do the therapy and the withdrawal. I'm usually seeing the person once a week. Occasionally we'll go to twice a week. I want the person to have this experience and to call me in a week. It's just going well. Can we really go much faster? And I always want to say, don't rush. I want to be the guy who says, why don't you go faster? Well, why don't you go fast? I always want to be the guy, unless it's an emergency, who says, well, let's take it easy. And as a result, with uncomplicated cases, by which I mean an individual who is autonomous, has a job or is raising kids, doing well in their lives, not dependent on their parents, everybody gets off, pretty much. 1 or 2 exceptions a few years ago with people who had trouble getting off the last tiny bits of Xanax or the last tiny bits of antidepressant and stayed on them. I haven't had that happen in a while. But you see how much it's about the patient. It's not, great doctor gets people off. No. Good, solid patients who are motivated, responsible, and independent, going slow, they'll find a way working with you to get off the meds. I have failed to do much for people who are on 5 drugs, living at home and smoking dope, for example. Although one of what I thought was the worst failures, I think I got him off 1 out of 5 drugs or something. Years later, somebody said, so-and-so really praises you. They have much less on their taking their drugs. So eventually that person did something and made some improvements. But so you can influence people that you don't know. But in general, if you're on multiple drugs and you're dependent, you need a lot of help to come off. And probably family therapy, working with whoever you're dependent upon. You need some real support. Whenever I can, Tim, I love to do I hate group. I'm terrible at group. I get very confused by all the people. One person loves me, the other person's jealous, another person, it's very complex. I like to build loving relationships, caring, responsible relationships with individuals, couples, and families. And I find that that's easy for me to do. Usually in the first day or 2, I'm getting along really well with whoever I'm working with. I don't think I could do that with a group of 8 people. I don't know. Somebody might have different skills than me. They can do that. But wherever possible, the person should be dealing with somebody in addition to the therapist who's monitoring them. Because we never, and I think this is almost like a really solid general principle, we never really attribute withdrawal problems to withdrawal. There's something about us humans, maybe that we have so many stresses and so many things that could aggravate us, we always think it's something else. We forget. And it doesn't matter whether you're coming off prednisone or if you, and which has a lot of withdrawal with potential psychological stuff. Yeah. It doesn't matter whether you're like me and you find out that you're irritable the morning after you take a Benadryl. I would take a Benadryl. I have allergies since I was a kid. I'll take a Benadryl and get up in the morning and not be as nice to Ginger. I like to be really super loving all the time in my marriage, and I really believe that people can do that and bring that out in each other. And I'll grump at her, and it took me the third or fourth time that I had a Benadryl.
Saw the connection.
That I would admit to the connection she saw.
Yep.
No. So when I say we, I mean we. People don't tend to attribute either drug adverse effects or drug withdrawal effects. They will sometimes. Sometimes they'll really get it straight, and they'll stop a drug, for example. But often we just don't. And I call that medication spellbinding. I am the only researcher I know that's ever defined this. I call it, when I do my scientific articles, intoxication and anosognosia. Anosognosia. I won't even try to spell it. Well, medication spellbinding. And you'll find that in Medication Madness, and you'll find it in my psychiatric drug withdrawal book. You'll also find it in my really heavy-duty medical book called Brain Disabling Treatments in Psychiatry. I tried to write in a lot of different ways for people, including blogs. We don't recognize it. There's a similar phenomena. People who get electroshock, the doctors always say, oh, they're just exaggerating their memory defects. No, people with injury minimize their injuries. It's called denial when it's psychological, but it's actually also anosognosia. It seems to be built into the human fabric, into the brain. You see it in all Alzheimer patients. They don't exaggerate their losses. They don't want to deal with them. They minimize them, and they can even get silly about it sometimes. So the patients don't tend to exaggerate.
And you were saying that it's important for the person to be working with somebody other than just the person who's helping them come off the medication.
Totally. I advise my college students. I'm in Ithaca. I have students from Cornell and Ithaca College and TC3. And I advise them to, if they don't want to get much involved with their parents about it, to have a roommate or a boyfriend or a girlfriend who they talk to every day. Somebody you talk to every day if you're not living with anybody. And sometimes have that person talk to me on the phone or come in so that they're aware of what's going on. And if they have a real partner, I'll say, why don't your partner just come in every time? Because I'll help you strengthen that relationship, your partnership. It's my specialty, is partnerships and love. So I'll help you strengthen that partnership while we get some better observation and some help at home. Another general principle that works well in withdrawal, and again, just please don't start your withdrawal based on this show. Oh my God. But another, by the way, I always forget, there are courses you can take of mine, and go to my website, breggin.com, BREGGIN.com, and surf down a little bit. You see my courses. And I do them through another website, a friend of mine, Pam Popper, who's a nutritionist. She did about 25 hours of filming me, and two of the results were a large course on psychiatric drug withdrawal, which is expensive. Practitioners family members, other people who are not professional. Some take it. I even show up for 2 nights. It's all on video. It's all interactive. And then there's a lot of videos and things you can watch and books to read. And you'll find that course. But there's also a short course for consumers on psychiatric drug withdrawal. That would be something that you might really want to do. It's I think a few $100s. I mean, it's marginal profit for Pam, and for me, because I really wanted to get that, make that available to people. So we've got a lot of different resources. I don't even keep track of them anymore.
Well, and that's one of the things that, in looking at your website, there is so much there. There's so many books. And I'm glad to hear you talk about that shorter course that might be there for consumers, and the bigger course, which we might be able to entice some professionals to engage in that work beyond just reading your book, How to Withdraw from Psychiatric Medications.
That course has a weekly on live portion to it. There's a young psychiatrist whom I'm very fond of who does that course at night for me. I don't necessarily want to expose her to unnecessary publicity, but she does that very quietly and does a beautiful job, runs like a seminar. It's a seminar weekly that goes along with it. And then I come on toward the end for a couple of nights anyway. So it's a very intense. You will know more about Peter Breggin than you ever imagined, but also about psychiatry than you imagined, and you'll really know how to do drug withdrawal. You take that course, there won't be a psychiatrist in the country other than maybe 2 or 3, or in the world other than 2 or 3 who know as much about withdrawing from the drugs or about their harms. I mean, that's no great achievement because psychiatrists are dumbed down. They are so dumbed down in their training. I do think actually you become more stupid as you become a psychiatrist now because you don't know even how to talk to an undrugged person. In the psychiatric training now, and I've actually talked to some young psychiatrists about this, you may never get to see a psychotic person who hasn't already been drugged. So you have no idea what it's like. Because how do you get to see a psychotic person if you're a psychiatrist? You either get a young psychiatrist, you're going to get to see them mostly in the hospital. They either get into the hospital because they were wildly out of control and heavily drugged in the ER, which is less common, or you get to see them because some practitioner has loaded them up and they're out of their minds and the psychiatrist has given up, or the practitioner or the GP or the family, and brought them in. You don't, as a young psychiatrist, work in a clinic where you're going to see new undrugged patients. Very unlikely. So your whole career is thinking that schizophrenia, bipolar, all these things are people who are kind of a little slow and can't really engage you with all their might and aren't brimming over with energy, and they're not necessarily going to be able to be calmed down in an hour when you engage them because the drugs don't let them connect well enough. They don't know that you can sit with somebody who's never seen a therapist before, who's hallucinating, who's maybe 18, 17 years old, and they're home from school because they had a breakdown. And you can sit with them, and within 15 minutes, you notice they're not hallucinating anymore because they're having their first honest conversation with anybody about alternative states, about losing control over your mind and experiencing all these things, some of which are exciting, but most of which are terrifying and humiliating and make you want to hide. And I will be very honest with patients about, in the first session, about my own experiences. I won't be honest on the air and so on, that's private, but I'll talk to them about my own vulnerabilities. If they're desperately suicidal, I will tell them that I've been there. And if you don't do it, you could end up having the wonderful life I have. But if you do it, you'll just leave a trail of misery. Be honest, good, honest conversation. I'll tell them, no, this is not a lifelong. You don't have to be this way all your life. And then maybe their parents will be there. And I'll invite the parents in, and if the patient wants me to, the first session. And I'll make a judgment, too, about whether it's safe, whether the parents are too upset and angry or disturbed. But I'll bring in the parents as soon as I can. I'll say, I know you're worried that I'm going to try to explain why your daughter got this way and so on, but I'm not going to do that. I don't want to go there. If you sometime want to come in private therapy with somebody, I'm going to help you, starting today, have a more loving communication with your daughter. Would you like that? Yeah. And maybe the patient will go, yeah, right. And I'll say, no, Jenny, give us a chance. This is new. Your parents at least were upset enough about you to bring you here instead of to a mental hospital. My gosh, let's start anew and let's just see what we can do. Because whether or not your parents caused your problems, whether or not they played a role in them, I know if we can have a more loving relationship with you and your parents, it's going to be a miracle for you. I know that. I just had no question about it because I've seen it again and again. So let's give this a try. Now, this is honest conversation. I don't know where else you're going to get it. Certainly from an MD, maybe a good psychologist you'll get it from. Maybe a coach. I don't think so because they'd be afraid to take that much responsibility. But this is it. Good conversation, good connectivity, trying to understand things. Not blaming parents to the parents, because what the heck good is that? Start out talking about what we can do new. Maybe eventually, if the patient wants to go there, and most people do, look at what happens between them and their parents that hurts them or did hurt them. But, and if necessary, to break with parents. I mean, some people do that. They just break with their parent. So it's not like I'm protecting the parents. It's like I'm trying to see, can we love one another?
Right. And as you were just saying, the resource that parents can be, if you can reestablish or establish, maybe even for the first time, a loving relationship, is the most healing thing that anybody will encounter.
Absolutely. And that even goes for older people. I mean, if you're 50 and you can establish for the first time a loving relationship with your 70-year-old mother or father, it's going to have a very good effect on you too.
Yeah, it's off the charts powerful. And
in fact, I'll give you a really, and then I'll give you a wonderful anecdote, which is, I've always been close to Ginger's mother, very close. It was just wonderful. She was the only woman I ever went out with. Practically, the mothers liked me. They always thought I was too intense and do this and do that, whatever. And a couple of years ago, my mother was having a lot of trouble with other family members living far away. And I looked at Ginge and I said, I'd like to ask your mom to come live with us. And she said, oh, yeah. So I asked Mom to come live with us. I thought it'd be great to have a son-in-law ask. She said, I can't. I said, why not, Mom? She said, I have two big dogs. I said, Mom, my wife is down to Yorkies. The only way I'm ever going to have a big dog again is if you come here. And I have healed at age 82 to 84 some of my wounds from my parents because her mother loves me so much and I love her. So, folks, we keep healing and it's wonderful. And wow, I think I'll take a deep breath and let you talk for a while. I have been just talking away here.
Well, you did, and we're pretty much out of time. I have somebody waiting for me to start my next session. I would love the opportunity to do another one of these where we're not hamstrung, so to speak, by the technology in the beginning and maybe book a longer time. You were saying that you're not going to get a conversation like that from a lot of people. Maybe they're afraid of the legal complications or implications. And that's why I so appreciate your book of how to make this withdrawal. Here's this outside reference that you provide, right? It's kind of.
Do you have the cover? Can you put it up? Do you have the book there? And show it to people.
It's the idea of Dr. Breggin's going to be my resource, right? He's going to be. I'm going to let him take all the heat because he's an actual medical doctor, psychiatrist, and he has said, here's a book on how to withdraw from psychiatric medications. And it's a guide not just for the patient, but for clinicians and family members. And I'm thrilled that that's out there, that you've done this work, that you have been a reformer, as you have for as long as you have. And I look forward to, as I said, making this available, letting people know. I've spent some time on your website, and I didn't know about the courses that you mentioned, so I'm glad to hear about that.
The website is so big. I think I need, if even you didn't see that, I probably need to do some tailoring. But yes, they're there.
But it's great to hear about it, and as I said, I would love to have the opportunity to do a longer talk in the not too distant future.
I'll be happy to come back to him and edit the devil out of this thing. It's all right to cut it and stuff.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, sir. It's a privilege meeting you, and I look forward to, within maybe a month or so, we'll hook up again and do a longer talk.
Give me a call. That'd be nice.
All right.
I really am, and I'm very devoted to psychologists being empowered.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate all you've done for us and a lot of the patients and families. So hang in there. Thank you so much. Take care. Dr. Peter Breggin, MD, is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and former consultant at the National Institutes of Mental Health, who has been called the Conscience of Psychiatry for his many decades of successful efforts to reform the mental health field. His work provides the foundation for modern criticism of psychiatric diagnoses and drugs, and leads the way in promoting more caring and effective therapies. Dr. Breggin has authored dozens of scientific articles and more than 20 books, including medical books and the bestsellers titled Toxic Psychiatry and Talking Back to Prozac. Two more recent books are Medication Madness: The Role of Psychiatric Drugs in Cases of Violence, Suicide, and Crime, and Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, a guide for prescribers, therapists, patients, and their families. His most recent book is Guilt, Shame, and Anxiety: Understanding and Overcoming Negative Emotions.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.